God in his sovereignty can move even through the brokenness and misunderstandings and confusion and different of opinion that sometimes wants to hijack what he's doing, but his will not be thwarted. If you are a human, you're going to experience friction. Even if you're a good, godly person, you will experience friction. Some of you are like, Tyler, I came to be encouraged today. Well, let me encourage you. You're going to face friction. But here's the good news. As we look to the end of Acts chapter 15, maybe you want to write this down, because some of us, we need to hold on to this truth. Sharp words don't have to write the final word. See, a lot of times in disagreements, sharp words get shared, and we're about to encounter a passage, a moment where two people who love Jesus, who are deeply committed to the mission of Jesus, actually have some sharp words. But what we need to understand is, as followers of Jesus, sharp words, they don't have to write the final word. Now, let me remind us where we were last week, just in case you weren't here, because we need to understand every time we come back into the book of Acts, we are continuing the same storyline and narrative. And that matters because last week we talked about the Jerusalem Council. There was a question that was brought up by Paul and Barnabas about what are we going to require these Gentile Christians to actually do? We asked this question, does there need to be two conversions? Do they need to first convert to Judaism, and then once they embrace all of the Old Testament law and customs, then are they allowed to trust in Jesus? Or is Jesus enough? As we talked about last week, the church decided that the grace of Jesus is enough. Anybody else thankful for that? The grace of Jesus is enough, and the church is unified in this decision. Paul and Barnabas, who were key witnesses to how God was moving amongst the Gentiles through their ministry, they are no doubt high-fiving one another because this is a victory for the gospel. And yet just a few verses later, Paul and Barnabas, partners in the gospel, partners in the work, they have a disagreement. Look with me, verse 36, Acts chapter 15. After some time had passed, Paul said to Barnabas, let's go back and visit the brothers and sisters in every town where we have preached the word of the Lord and see how they're doing. Barnabas wanted to take along John, who was called Mark. But Paul insisted that they should not take along this man who had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not gone in with them in the work. They had such a sharp disagreement. Can you say sharp? They had such a sharp disagreement that they parted company, and Barnabas took John Mark with him and sailed off to Cyprus. But Paul chose Silas and departed after being commended by the brothers and sisters to the grace of the Lord. He traveled through Syria, Sicilia, and strengthening the churches in that region. Here you have two individuals. They've already completed one missionary journey. They've brought the gospel to the Gentiles. They've seen the miracles. They've suffered for the cause of Christ. And even these good, godly men have a disagreement. You see, this is one of the reasons why I love the Bible. The Bible doesn't airbrush the reality of what these humans are walking through. The Bible doesn't try to dress it up. Notice that Luke, as he's writing, he doesn't say and give us some clarity. Well, 5 minutes later, they got together and they started singing worship and everything was good. It just says that there was a sharp disagreement. They separated ways and they went on. Again, this is following the Jerusalem Council, a huge win for the gospel of Jesus Christ. And understand, this is after 10 plus years of friendship, devotion, sacrifice, miracles, suffering. One of the things that's going on that I think it's maybe easy for us to miss is that this disagreement isn't over sin. You see, the reality is sometimes people want to use this passage to justify sin. Well, we're just going to agree to disagree because that's not how I see it. That's not what this is going after here. In fact, this passage has been used to justify things like church splits. We're just going to go our own separate way. We're just going to agree to disagree. That's not what this passage is justifying. There's a tension in this passage. Why? Because there is a disagreement between two people who deeply love Jesus. And it's not just a disagreement. I want you to think about this context. It says that there's a sharp disagreement. I think sometimes we like to airbrush scripture a little bit because maybe when you've read this passage, if you've read it before, you're like, you kind of see Barnabas going, well, Paul, I really think we should bring John Mark. And Paul's like, well, Barnabas, listen, I don't think that's the right decision. But, maybe that's what you want to do, but I just don't think. This is not that moment. This is heated. This is passionate. Sharp disagreement. The root here is where we get our English word paroxysm. That idea of a sudden violent outburst, a fit, an uncontrollable spasm, intense surge of emotion. How many of you know somebody who has ever had an outburst? See, sometimes we think, no, if you're a follower of Jesus, like you just gentle. Love Jesus. Well, whatever you want to do, Barnabas. Well, whatever you want to do, Paul. There's such a sharp disagreement that these brothers separate ways. And here's what I want you to notice. Notice what Luke writes and what he doesn't write. Luke isn't endorsing the division, he's reporting it. This is important. He's not saying, so they sat down, they prayed, and they felt led by the Spirit to part ways. Luke doesn't give that directive. He's describing what happens, division that takes place. And so today, I want us to lean into three things. We're going to lean into the tension of this. We're going to lean in and look at the reality of what this means, but then also look to the hope. So let's deal with the tension. The tension is this: who is right? Because how many of us believe in every argument one person is right, which means the other person is? How many of you in your own life, in your disagreements, you're convinced there's someone here that's right, there's another individual that's wrong, I happen to know who is who? That's where disagreement comes from. Imagine a world where everybody agreed with you. How many of you feel like that sounds pretty good? But the problem is there is some disagreement. Why? Because not everybody assumes what you see is right, because they're on the other side of it looking at the same thing. And guess what they assume? They're right. And so the tension in this story, who is Right, because somebody has to be right, don't they? See, here's something important for us to recognize. Anytime you have more than one human, you have all of the necessary ingredients for conflict. All it takes is more than one of us. And you have everything necessary for conflict, for division. And here's one thing we have to notice. Notice that Paul and Barnabas, they are both saved. They are both spirit-filled. They both love and are loved by Jesus. Not only that, they're aligned in the mission. They return from Jerusalem. They go back to Antioch. They minister there. And then all of a sudden, Paul says to Barnabas, hey, let's go back to all the places we planted the church and the gospel, and let's go see how they're doing. And Barney's like, yes, let's do it. They're not only aligned in the mission, they're aligned in their theology. The Jerusalem Council, man, an incredible moment. But they had a disagreement about who should join them. See, here's what we learn. Barnabas is acting like Barnabas. Barnabas is simply being consistent with who he is. Barnabas was the one who we know as the son of encouragement. Remember what Barnabas did in Acts chapter 9, verse 27. This man named Saul supposedly gets saved. The church is skeptical, but what does Barnabas do? Barnabas steps in and says, no. Saul's legit. Saul's the real guy. Saul's the real deal. And what does Barnabas do? Barnabas steps towards somebody that the church wanted to write off. So what do we see going on? Barnabas is just being Barnabas. He's just being consistent with who he is. And guess what Paul is being? Paul is just being Paul. Paul is being full on himself. This is the same guy who risked his life, literally had stones thrown at him. The next morning gets up and goes back into the city. He risks his life, the lives of his companions in advancing the gospel. And Paul remembers in Acts chapter 13, verse 13, John Mark deserts them in the middle of the mission. And Paul understands the risk and the potential exposure of bringing John Mark back. Barnabas is acting like Barnabas. Paul is acting like Paul. These are good, godly Jesus followers. And they're seeing the same exact thing from different angles. You see, this is the root of so much conflict. For those of you who are married, often the things that create conflict, you're looking at the exact same thing, but the reality is you're looking at it from two different angles. This happens in your workplace. It happens on school campuses where there's disagreements and misunderstandings, and it happens even with godly people. You see, they're both looking at the same thing. What are they looking at? They're looking at John Mark. They're looking at one individual, Paul. Who's he looking at? John Mark. Barnabas, who's he looking at? John Mark. And Paul, he's fighting for the future of the mission. Is that right or wrong? It's not a trick question. Paul's fighting for the future of the mission of Jesus. Is that right or wrong? It's right. It's right. That's not a trick question. How many believe the future of the mission of Jesus matters? Okay. And that's what Paul's committed to. The mission is too important. It's too valuable. Paul is fighting for the future of the mission. Barnabas is fighting for the future of a man. Is it right or is it wrong? That was more muddy than I wanted it to be. What is it right or is it wrong? So wait, if I understand your theology, Life Center, you're saying Paul is right and Barnabas is right. What do we do with that? What do we do with that? You see, we live in a world where somebody has to be right and somebody has to be wrong, but what we sometimes forget is that God in his sovereignty can move even through the brokenness and misunderstandings and confusion and different of opinion that sometimes wants to hijack what he's doing, but his will not be thwarted.